Thank you.
Hello, my name is Larry Wayne Harris, and I am a registered microbiologist. I was born and raised in the hills of southwestern Virginia, having lost my parents when I was a very small boy. I was adopted by my fraternal grandparents, Kervin and Alfie Harris. Many times while I was growing up, my grandparents told me stories of the great swine flu epidemic in 1918. Kervin was in the United States Army in Vancouver, Washington, when the swine flu first hit. The initial symptoms were very mild. You felt a little rough, but no one was sick enough to miss work. Also, some Army bases in Texas were reporting similar symptoms. Many of these troops were bound for the trenches of World War I. During many of these battles, mustard gas was being used, a known mutagen. Shortly after this, a killer flu developed that was known as the Spanish Maiden. When the troops returned to the United States, they brought the killer flu with them and spread it throughout the country. Alpha, my grandmother, was living near her parents, the Clevingers, in a coal mining community of Bradshaw, Kentucky. Kervin had just returned from the Army, and he and Alpha had just started setting up housekeeping when the swine flu first hit. The community had a single road running through the middle of the houses. The north side, the houses were known as the Noah's Ark, the south side, the Titanic. In a few days, scenes right out of the Middle Ages when the plague raged Europe appeared. Since Kervin had already contacted and had recovered from the swine flu in this mild form, he was immune. So was his brothers, George and Bill Harris. They were among the very few who did not catch the flu, now in its killer form. In a few days, just about everyone in the community was literally down with the flu. In a few more days, a large number of people were dying. At first, the undertaker could keep up, but very shortly, they simply could not keep up anymore. Kervin and his brother started digging graves as fast as they could. But soon, individual graves could not be dug fast enough. Soon, entire families or parts of families had to be buried in single graves. In a few days, with their strength almost gone, they had to start putting the bodies into a coal mine and started stacking them up like cordwood. At one end of town, there was a large diner that served the miners. In the diner was 2 large cook stoves. They put 2 large wash tubs on these and put vegetables and beef in to make a beef stew. This they would put into buckets and go around the entire community to feed the people. Once they returned to the diner in the afternoon, they'd hook up the horses to a large freight wagon, and then they would go house to house calling, "Bring out the dead, bring out the dead." Once the swine flu had burned itself out, there was nearly 20 million people worldwide was dead. The Bradshaw community was hard hit. Kervin and Alpha Harrison lost their first child, a little girl. The entire community was devastated. I had fallen in love with microbiology when I was a small boy, vowing to my grandparents that I would become a microbiologist when I grew up, so that I might be able to prevent a great plague like this from ever happening again. I trapped muskrats for their pelts to buy my first microscope, a used one, the one here, still with me today. And I literally developed my own mad scientist laboratory. I had to, because I accidentally blew up my high school's laboratory in '68, and they banned me from that part of the building ever again. As a matter of fact, in 1988, I returned home, and while visiting the town, I ran into the teacher who was in the laboratory the day it exploded. He said he still hadn't gotten all the glass out. During my senior year in high school, I went to the Army recruiter and I told him I would enlist when I graduated if he could find me a place I could work in a microbiology laboratory. A few days later, I got a letter back from the recruiter and informed me that he had located a laboratory at Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland, where I was stationed. A few days after graduation, I enlisted in the Army, and after basic training, I was stationed at Aberdeen Proving Grounds. I worked my way through Aberdeen, the military, biological warfare, defense. I was always defense. I was never offense. It would have absolutely nothing to do with offense. After graduating from the military, actually finishing up my tour in the military, I was released from the military, and I returned to college, went to Ohio State University. And while at Ohio State University, there was another laboratory that joined itself to Ohio State, which is known as the Battelle Institute. While at the Patel Institute, we also did research in biological warfare. And as it happened in 1972, when we first got out, when I first got out of the military, we had signed treaties banning all forms of offensive and defensive biological warfare. Biowar was considered a great harm to the world as a large, and so they banned it. They simply disbanded it. What actually happened then was that the military started took the biological warfare entity, they busted it up and broke it up into large numbers of very small little cells all over the United States. Seems like the treaty that was signed was between individual nations. It had nothing to do with private corporations. And so I studied through Ohio State University. Basically, we're working part-time in a laboratory, just getting my expertise in microbiology up. After graduating, I went down south, Florida area, worked in a small private laboratory for many years as a clinical microbiologist. 1984, I was recruited back by the company being the Central Intelligence Agency, to work in a small reference laboratory. And while at that laboratory, we started seeing some very unusual microbes. Basically, the bacteria that we were starting to observe was that if the CIA went out in the field somewhere and they found a microbe, and they thought that it may have been used as a biological warfare agent, they would bring it back to a reference laboratory, ours was one of many, and seeing could this have been a biological warfare agent? Could this have been genetically engineered? In other words, it didn't happen in nature. It wasn't just a combination in nature. This is something that happened in nature, or actually engineered. And then, how do we find the back door? Back door being a way to treat it. In the laboratory in the later 80s, we were told that the Ayatollah Khomeini was getting ready to use biological warfare in an offensive manner against one of our allies, the Iraqis. And we were starting to train in the Iraqis on how to defend against biological warfare. And so I had several Iraqi students in my laboratory, and we were training them. And there's one young girl there, nice lady, named Miriam Arif, and we were teaching them how to defend against biological warfare. In 1988, we got a hold 1988, we got a hold of an unusual organism that was a mycoplasma. We tested the mycoplasma. It was a mycoplasma fermentis, which was a common soil microbe, but it had incredible invasive properties. We ran an HPLC on it, high-pressure liquid chromatograph, which gives us a fingerprint of the bacteria. And after we ran the fingerprint, we would stockpile it in their computer, find out what to treat it with, and go on to the next microbe. In 1991, when the Gulf War was going on, all the Iraqi microbiologists in our laboratory was gone, of course. They were considered a security risk. Early in 91, I started seeing some very unusual symptoms coming in. And there was a hospital up in Mansfield, Ohio, and I was friends with the epidemiologist there, and also the pulmonary specialist. And he asked me, he said, Larry, would you mind coming up here? We got some very unusual patients coming in, some of the craziest symptoms I've ever seen in my life. We are sending out samples from these patients to many different laboratories, and we're at odds what's going on. We don't know what's happening. And so I said, sure, no problem. So I went up, and they had two girls there, two young ladies, and these young ladies were very, very badly ill. Very crazy symptoms, scalded skin syndrome, stuff of this nature. I took a couple of blood samples from each one of them, went back to the laboratory, spun the blood down the centrifuge, ran an HPLC on it. When I ran the HPLC, I fed it into the computer. The computer gave me a match and showed that in 1988 that it was a biological warfare agent. And I was very concerned about these ladies, being contracted with a biological warfare agent. And so I started making some inquiries, large numbers of inquiries. To my surprise, the Center of Disease Control told me, just forget about it. They're on top of it. It was a new strain of virus coming into the area. Don't worry about it. But I didn't. And I started running through my computer scans and found out you could treat it with ordinary tetracycline. Viruses you can't treat with tetracycline. I told the pulmonary specialist up at Mansfield, I said, go ahead and use tetracycline on the ladies, and their symptoms started clearing up. After the symptoms started clearing up, I started making more inquiries about this agent. And to my section chief said, Larry, drop it. We want you to drop it right now. Forget about it. And so after I started looking more in depth into it, latter part of July of '91, I came into the laboratory on a Friday morning, and the laboratory was gone. The whole laboratory had been literally cleaned out, totally cleaned out. They handed me my personal effects in my little black plastic bag, and they said goodbye. And as luck would have it, all the time when I would go through and doing research, I'd always keep a notebook, write down my research in notebooks and stuff of this nature. And when a notebook got full in the laboratory, I'd bring it home, throw it in the bottom of the closet, forget about it, and go on. That day when I left the laboratory, I had all my notebooks. And also, I took the opportunity when I left the laboratory to go back to college. I wanted to go back to college and take some advanced courses in microbiology, which I did. And so in September 1991, I re-entered Ohio State University and started taking courses in advanced microbiology, which is actually in preparation for taking my National Registry of Microbiologists certification exam. I soon entered a clique of non-traditional students whose average age was around 40. In that clique was the delightful young lady known as Miriam Arift, which I would work with in the laboratory before. We soon become very close friends. Miriam, like I said, was from Iraq and was here studying microbiology. She had a very unusual background. One of her close relatives, General Arif, was president of Iraq, and in April 1966, he was killed in a helicopter accident. There was a long succession of military coups, and now Saddam Hussein and the Republican Guard were in power. In these coups, her family had not fared too well. She said several of her family members had been hanged, and at the present time, she felt that it was safer for her to be in America until that she could do something that would make her very famous back in Iraq. And so I kind of chuckled it off and stuff of this nature. And let's fast forward, February 1993. I arrived early in order to get a parking spot in a rapid-filling student parking lot and was having coffee in a small vending area in the bottom of the MedTech building where the MedTech courses were taught. The vending area that morning was deserted except for Miriam Arif. I will never forget the way her eyes looked that morning, very tired and glossy, and I had little doubt that she had gotten any sleep since the World Trade Center had been bombed. This was the Monday after. She must have thought that her arrest was imminent, and for the whole time she kept rambling on, and it was as if she was in a daze. She was silent for a few minutes, then said, Larry, your dear and trusted friend, and what I'm going to tell you over the next few minutes, you can use to protect yourself and a few friends. Because when it comes my time to act, I do not want your death to be on my conscience. You obviously do not know the danger you face concerning the emergence of biological warfare as being a major threat to North America. She went on to state that nearly all emerging countries, Libya, Syria, Iraq, North Korea, were actively pursuing a germ warfare program and were scrapping their nuclear program. There are two main reasons for this. The first being the complexity and cost of acquisition of sufficient nuclear stockpiles to be meaningful. The second reason is that biological warfare is anti-personnel warfare, not anti-material warfare, and that housing, buildings, factories, and other structures remain intact and can be used after a very short time. I asked her if she'd actually seen the Iraqis' germ warfare facilities offensive, and she gave a resounding yes, very much so. She went on to state that Iraq uses a plain Jane approach, and that Iraq has a very large stockpiles of biological agents on hand in the special bombs, and was developing rockets that would spread the infection over very large areas. They had two separate areas of biological operations, one foreign, one regional. The one that are regional are all facilities are located at small airstrips around the country and are deliberately designed not to draw much attention. These airstrips will not handle large to medium aircraft. In fact, are designed around a single class of aircraft. These aircraft are single-engine, high-wing turboprops and can be used for crop dusting. The regional biological operations would take only a couple of days to get an operation if they're using anthrax, or a couple of weeks if they're using plague. The chemostats, which are used to grow the bacteria located at these facilities, can be explained away as holding tanks for agricultural spray products if they're kept empty, and there never be questioned if they're in case they were ever questioned. In order to get them to operation, it would first cycle through a sterilization phase. A nutrient broth would be introduced. Then the desired biological agent would be introduced, usually plague in this case. The device for rapidly mixing the cultures is activated, and ultrafiltered air is added. Fresh growth media from a reservoir is fed in at a constant rate, and the culture vessels through a metering pump. A constant volume is maintained, and by means of an overflow, which removes the culture fluid and the desired bacteria at the same rate fresh media is added. The culture fluid is drawn into a refrigerated tank for holding before it is transferred to an aircraft just before emission. Merriam further stated that these aircraft have exceptionally long range and that only one aircraft is located at each facility, and if the aircraft was lost, a replacement aircraft would be flown in from another facility. They are kept very small and very difficult to detect. And I asked her why they didn't see any germ warfare being waged during the Gulf War, and she responded, we did use germ warfare. The Iraqi military adhered to in part, the Soviet military doctrine, which is the Soviet military doctrine's modus operandi is chemical warfare should be conducted with mixed agents. Mixed agents, often referred to as cocktails, are intended to enhance the capacities of nerve agents and defeat precautions taken by the enemy. The cocktails can be made by combining a mixture of biological toxins, nerve agents, vesicants, and some biological agents such as bacteria and fungi. Merriam stated that she had personally worked in a germ warfare laboratory and that they had developed and used Mycoplasma fermentis, later called incognitus, and which had inserted an HIV envelope gene. The genetic manipulation rendered a relatively benign mycoplasma much more invasive and pathogenic and capable of attacking many organs and tissue systems of the body simultaneously. This can, by the way, very effectively be treated with tetracycline. Merriam also stated they isolated a form of Ebola virus, which took 3 to 7 years to kill you. And in the next few years, hundreds of thousands of Vietnam Gulf veterans and their families will start dying. And I asked her, why did not Iraq use these biological weapons during the Gulf, the fast-acting biologicals? And she said they were afraid that the Gulf War, if we used the fast-acting biological weapons, that the United States would respond with thermonuclear weapons. And I said, Miriam, you stated that myself and the North American people were in grave dangers of biological agents being used against us. I said, would you elaborate? And said, to this she replied, a few hours ago, a band of fanatics blew up the World Trade Center. I am sure that my beloved Iraq did not do this thing. For when it comes time to payback, I'm sure that we will demand at least one American life for every one of my countrymen that you butchered. And we are not going to settle for some silly old building. And I asked her, I said, do you know how such an attack will be carried out? To this she responded, don't be silly, of course I know. For you see, all operations will be batch operations. For unlike the very complex chemostats where you have to have a constant output, and once you're up and running, with a batch operation, all you need is a sterile vessel from, say, a test tube up to 10 liters. To this, you add an appropriate amount of dehydrated media, which is very easily obtained in this country without questions. To this, you add the proper amount of distilled water and bring it to a boil and let it simmer for 15 minutes. This is why you don't have to use an autoclave. Keep it simple. This is allowed to cool to room temperature. The tops of the container is covered with a sterile cloth, sterilized inside of a pressure cooker like you cook in. The vessel of choice that they would be using would be a metal spray can, you know, like the ones they use to spray bugs with, like the exterminators used. The one that has a little air pump in the middle. All you got to do once you're ready is pump it up and you're ready. To this you would add your culture. A small heating pad is placed around the tank, a small air stone and tubing, and I'd boil for at least an hour, very aseptically placed in a metal spray can and hooked up to the aquarium air pump. You then add a starter culture bacteria, which is plague or anthrax. After an appropriate amount of time, the batch is ready. You then insert the spray tank, pump it up, and you're ready to go. And I asked her what would be the most likely targets, and this responded, for one thing, there would not just be one target, but many hundreds of targets simultaneously across the United States. The prime of these targets would be metropolitan areas. And other inviting targets would be like the air ducts of large office buildings, or say large gatherings of people like a stadium. Or you're literally just sticking the tube out the side of a building and letting it spray. Who's going to notice a little bit more mist coming out the side of the building? Several cells, each cell has 10 men and 1 woman to act as a carrier, will be using aircraft ventures, like the one that are used to drive the vacuum pumps inside of aircraft, vacuum instruments. They're easily obtained in this country, mail order. These will be mounted underneath the cars, and the spray tanks are in the cars with the tubing going down to the ventures. The venturi acts like a carburetor. And when the car gets around 60 miles per hour, one opens the valve, and a fog of death will be coming up behind the car. Other cells will be using the same ventures mounted on light aircraft to attack whole cities at a time. And I asked her how they would get the culture, the bacterial culture. And this, she replied, it is very easy for a woman to hide a small sealed vial of dehydrated culture vessel inside the body cavity and get it into North America. What are they going to do? Take every woman that enters into the country and have some little room in the airport and make them go and lie down on a table and have their feet up in the straps and have someone look up their privates? I think not. And I asked her, why not use something that you can obtain in this country without going through all that? To this she replied, this is where the real irony is, for you see, Iraq bought all the dehydrated vials from companies right here in the United States who shipped them to Iraq. These same vials are the ones that the Iraqi women are being brought back into this country to use again in the country. Miriam stated that she had made several trips back and forth between Iraq and the United States. Every time that she came back into the United States, she was carrying a vial of the dehydrated anthrax, and either anthrax or bubonic plague. And one thing I asked her, I said, the microbes of choice, and she said bubonic plague and anthrax. She said for plague, it's very easy to work with. We will take a proper amount of antibiotic, and then we're safe to work with it. Once you're finished, you can very easily clean up any spills with disinfectant. And if you miss any will be dead within a couple of days. The anthrax will be used with specially trained cells to attack big cities. These cells have to be extremely careful and have a lot of advanced training. If you get some on your clothing and you happen to inhale it several years later, it could kill you. So they will have to strip thoroughly and shower and leave every article of clothing behind. And what will be worn on attack will be left behind. The only other bacteria that would be considered was typhoid, fever, and cholera, and these were mostly nuisance. I then asked her when she thought the attacks would begin, and she responded, sometime in the next few years. The attacks are centered on 3 Muslim holy days that are coming up. For over 20 years, the Muslim Sufis have been saying that the great Satan would strike the heel of Allah sometime in the 90s. When they struck the heel of Allah, that would start off a Muslim timetable. 3 holy periods would arise. When the 3rd holy period had arisen, the Muslims will have reconquered the world. The first of these come up in July of 97, because you see, Kuwait, which they considered was the heel of Allah. The great Satan, they considered to be the United States. The next will be sometime in the year 1999, the next in 2001. One thing is certain, before the year 2002, the country's population will be down less than 50 million. Then, after we talked with Miriam that morning, Miriam seemed to be a lot calmer, easier. And she said, Larry said, why don't you meet me this afternoon up on the 3rd story of the main library where we can have some privacy? So I need to slip back to my apartment. I want to get you something I want to show you. That afternoon, I met Miriam in the main library, and we found a secluded place in the towers. Miriam opened a briefcase and took out a map of the United States that had been divided up into grids. Each grid had a number, the latitude and longitude designations. Miriam stated these grids were cells already in place, and hundreds of cells would be in place before July of '97. Miriam took out another map, and it was a map of this nation's power grid. On the map were the little blue squares. Upon closer examination, these were power plants. Beside each square was a number, latitude and longitude. Miriam stated that these were cell designations. Miriam stated this country's electric power was generated at 12,000 volts, but was stepped up to over 100,000 volts for transmission. These step-up transformers are unique in that they are custom built for each power plant. To her knowledge, there are no backups because they are so expensive. These transformers are oil-cooled and have large cooling radiators on their sides. These radiators are the nation's Achilles heels in that they are, for all practical purposes, not guarded right out in the open and easily to get with a special little goodie that Iraq has come up with. The little blue squares are those step-up transformers, and the numbers are the cells members whose job before they head back to Iraq is to take out those transformers. The latitude and longitude of these transformers are so precise that if it become necessary, they can lay in an 81 millimeter mortar. Miriam then took out of her briefcase a set of blueprints, and she said, "This is a little goodie that Iraq has come up to take out those transformers." She said that you simply go to the hardware store right here in America and buy a 9-inch piece of 5/8 all thread and a 3-inch piece. You then either buy a small 4-inch lathe, or better yet, go to a large number of hungry small machine shops and who will not ask many questions, and you end up with a tail igniter for a hand grenade. You then take a 1/4-inch bar, bar stock 6 inches long, and you end up with a firing pin and a safety collar. Then at their pleasure, they take the tail igniter and put them together, assemble them. They have a tail igniter for the grenade. They buy a surplus pineapple hand grenades bought from any Army surplus store in this country, thread the 5/8 hole at the front of the grenade after being filled with a double base shotgun or pistol powder. They screw in the point, a sharpened point. Miriam stated that all you had to do is purchase a 4-foot-long segment of heavy-gauge water pipe, slide the rifle grenade in one end, pour in an extremely accurate measured black powder charge, then put in a wooden dowel rod fitted with 2 tight-fitting O-rings equipped with an electric igniter. Then a very dry sea sand acquired at the same aquarium air store where he bought the air stones is poured in until it completely fills the back of the pipe. Then the back of the pipe is sealed with duct tape. Each unit is fired once and discarded, and is equipped with a very simple but very accurate sight. Mary stated that that she had practiced using these units in Iraq, and that they were very accurate out to several hundred yards. And when it comes time to dealing with those high voltage step-up transformers, you simply put this over your shoulder, get your range, set your sights, press the igniter. Equal blast goes out the back as forcing the grenade forward, thus no recoil. The inertia throws the firing pin to the rear, allowing the safety collar to slide back. When the grenade plows into the transformer, the sharp point pins the grenade in place, and the grenade stops. But the inertia throws the firing pin forward, striking a shotgun shell primer. The primer detonates and ignites the double-base powder, producing large numbers of high-energy fragments, ripping the guts out of the high-voltage step-up transformers. Miriam stated that each cell was equipped with 20 units. And then she kind of said with a very kind of a snicker, "Made in America." Miriam stated she had no problem telling this because no one will ever believe me. She stated that she was on the move and would probably not see me again, and to please give her at least a week before I started asking any questions, because she knew my curiosity would get the better of me. She closed her briefcase, got up and headed for the elevator, stopped and turned around me and put her hand out in a gesture like Spock from Star Trek and said, "Live long and prosper." She turned into the elevator was gone. A few days later, I started a barrage of phone calls to the FBI, CIA, and just about everyone I knew to call. But Miriam was right. No one believed me. Every bureaucrat that I called was simply not interested. I called CDC back, and after an afternoon of phone tag, I finally transferred to Fort Collins, the Vector Division. I told them what Miriam had told me, and they responded that they thought I'd been watching too many science fiction movies, and not to worry about it. I asked them if there was a contingency plan if this ever occurred. They said that they did, and I asked them if they'd send me a copy. They said that they would, but after a couple of weeks, nothing arrived. So I called them back. After several weeks, no contingency plan. I put them on the spot, and finally asked them, why did you not send me a contingency plan? And if there is no contingency plan, so state. Finally, the Center for Disease Control stated in 1972, all biological civil defense programs have been scrapped. There are no contingency plan. The United States is wide open. I literally just about flipped. And they said, well, you're a microbiologist, and you're so concerned, why don't you go out and write your own civil defense manual and leave the CDC alone? A couple of days later, my curiosity got the best of me. And frustration arose enough to start checking out the larger things what Miriam had stated. I first went to the Biological Science building on the college campus and sought out one of the professors who had experience with the chemostats. And he gave me papers to verify the things Miriam said regarding the chemostat operation. I next went to the Biological Sciences building and got all the information on plague they had, and learned that from the librarian that a visiting English microbiologist who had written several papers on advancing germ warfare will be lecturing there in a few weeks. March 1993, I attended the lecture put on by the visiting microbiologist. After he had finished his findings and had taken all the questions from the audience, I went forward and offered to buy him a cup of coffee at the little coffee shop across from the library, which he accepted. I wanted to raise the question, what is the possibility of germ warfare becoming a threat to North America? And if germ warfare is within the possibility of being acquired by a highly motivated and intelligent organization, why have we not seen it being used? His response was that there is no clear and cut answer to this question. But an explanation goes something like this. In the 1940s, when we first began to look at the possibility of using germ warfare, there were few, if any, antimicrobial drugs. So we had no way of really protecting our own troops. It was not in the later 60s, when we acquired large numbers of antibiotics, that the possibility of using germ warfare really developed. However, about this time, it became apparent that just about any small country that could afford a laboratory could develop an offensive biological weapons program. At this point, the U.S. government started an active program of demonization of all aspects of biological warfare. This included co-sponsoring the production of several movies, The Omega Man, The Virus, The Adronomous Strain, and others, in an effort to scare the American public. In 1972, this resulted in the United States signing a convention on the prohibition of the development and production of biological stockpiles and toxic weapons and destroying existing weapons. The U.S. government went on to glamorize those countries that possessed nuclear weapons, referring to those as a nuclear club. The strategy worked. Numerous small countries invested in large portions of their defense budget towards obtaining nuclear weapons. However, the Iraq War shocked many of the small countries back into the reality. They simply could not afford to go nuclear. Bacteriological and toxic weapons they could afford. The lecture went on to state very clearly that in the next few years, the United States could almost certainly look forward to massive amounts of biological warfare being used upon the United States. And to give you an idea just how devastating the biological weapons actually are, and let's start discussing anthrax. Anthrax for a minute. And if you would, we would roll the first little strip we have on the anthrax.
There are variations in these invisible killers, different forms of biological weapons. One type is made up of bacteria, some of them natural, like anthrax. Less than 1/10 of 1/1,000,000th of a gram can kill. 30 grams could wipe out the entire population of the United States. This is anthrax infection of the skin. If the infection reaches the lungs, the victim suffers choking, fever, and death within 4 days.
You may be asking, what is anthrax? What exactly is anthrax? Anthrax is a bacteria that is found inhabiting the soil in certain parts of the world. There's several places in the Middle East has anthrax, stuff of this nature. Anthrax is an extremely viable organism. Give you a little history of it being used as a biological warfare agent. As you've seen from the strip, 1/10 of a millionth of a gram is fatal. It simply doesn't take that much anthrax to be absolutely devastating. And how hard would it be for someone getting a hold of, let's just say, take an example. If a group of people wanted to get together and build an atomic bomb, let's say we had 100 people get together in a group, and they want to build an atomic bomb. How hard is it going to be for us to build an atomic bomb? Considering that the fissionables, the materials of this nature, are just about impossible to get a hold of, that entire governments around the world have spent billions of dollars trying to obtain one, the odds of getting an atomic bomb are almost remote. Let's go to chemical weapons, nerve gas, poison gas. Enough to develop a nerve gas, chemicals, poison gas to be meaningful, you're talking about hundreds of tons being meaningful. Now let's talk about anthrax. How hard is it to get a hold of anthrax? I put myself to this challenge here a few years ago and just sat down and said, how long would it take me as a microbiologist to go out and get some anthrax? The only thing that I did, I went to the local newspapers, I ran a search on when they had the last anthrax outbreak in their community, which it turned out to be during the 50s. I went back, searched those articles, found out the microbiologist who was in charge of that project, went and talked with him. He had retired he was retired in a little community north of here. I asked him, what did you do with the corpses? Did you burn them, or did you put them in lime pits? They said, no, we just dug holes and buried them in it. I said, where were they? He showed me where they were. I went out there, took a tile probe, probed down, took 5 test tubes with some methanol alcohol in it, washed the tips of the probe off after it had been probed into the ground, then streaked it out on a special media. Within 10 days of starting the project, I had a culture of anthrax. Now, if I can obtain anthrax that quickly, how quickly could an individual or government obtain the anthrax? The answer is very, very quickly. And to give you an idea, are the governments of the world getting ready to look at biological warfare? Let's look at a series of articles here that was actually ran on the emergence of biological warfare across the world. In this article, threat of a germ attack on the United States seen possible. Military wants soldiers protected in the event of a biological warfare. Let's see, the Department of Defense is making plans to inoculate all of America's 1.5 million military personnel to protect them from deadly anthrax. Let's see, agents of the Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein are planning a massive biological warfare attack against America, which includes the use of anthrax germs. Anthrax is a deadly disease of wild or domestic animals, particularly sheep, which can easily be transmitted to people. According to the report of the Reuters news agency, the Washington Post reported that the ensuing of anthrax vaccination plan is at the top of military planning, which means they're going all out to inoculate large numbers of Americans for anthrax. Glance at a quick series of other articles upon this very same issue. Technology. The article of this article. Technology opens Pandora's box. New threat to 20th century. As the 20th century ends, biological, chemical, and other weapons are now becoming the mainstay. Biological weapons are the ultimate of the weapons of mass destruction. And now We have sold huge quantities of these biological agents to governments overseas. The Iraqi government, that brings up an interesting question. How did Iraq get a hold of their biological warfare agents to begin with? Did they do like I did, went out in nature and recover some anthrax? Not really. Where Iraq actually got their biological warfare weapons from was from right here in the United States. There are several corporations which made an enormous amount of money, huge, huge amounts of money, on biological warfare, manufacturing, selling, and producing biological warfare agents. And this goes right to the top of the list. Who were these individuals that went directly counter to the 1972 ban against biological warfare agents? Well, it may be interesting to know there's one corporation that was known as the American Type Culture Collection out of Rockville, Maryland, who sold Saddam Hussein huge quantities of biological agents, incredible quantities of biological agents. Again, purely as a money-making operation. And also, why is it that the United States, even though we stopped on paper research on biological warfare agents, has continued to research on biological agents? Research on germ warfare goes on after cancellation, meaning that after the United States signed a treaty and canceling biological warfare agents, we continued to manufacture biological warfare agents. So, see, in the mid-1970s, the CIA's MK Ultra Biological Research Program at Fort Detrick, Maryland was shut down, primarily the result of congressional investigations. Portions of that government research data were farmed out to Wake and Hunt Corporation, a private security facility, headquarters in and around the United States. Meaning what happened was the CIA, like good old boys, they started taking the biological warfare agents and they started farming them out. Literally as a way to make huge quantities of money. And you may be interested to know is how this affects you as an individual. Break up. Who would be interested in selling death to use on our own people? Arms dealers linked to biological warfare agents plaguing the Gulf War vets. Biological weapons, huge quantities, were sold by the Wake and Hunt Corporation, which is located out of California, which is partially owned by the Hercules Corporation. They manufactured, sold, and produced large quantities of biological agents. These agents were then sold to Saddam Hussein. These very agents, also you had another little corporation down in Texas known as Tanex Corporation, which was rumored to be owned by George Bush and James Baker III. They in turn manufactured huge quantities of biological agents and then sold these biological agents to Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein in turn then used these very biological agents on our truth, exactly as Miriam Arif told me early on where these biological agents came from. Fatal virus in government labs since 1970s. Evidence suggests Gulf War syndrome may be the results of biological warfare. Quite frankly, meaning that here in the good old United States, after we signed treaties banning the use of biological warfare, we kept right on manufacturing huge quantities of biological warfare agents, selling them in mass, huge quantities, to individuals around the world. This actually makes, we're talking about the political scandals and stuff of this nature. Watergate, now we got Whitewater and all this stuff. If the American people out here ever suddenly learned the truth, the real truth, the huge numbers, we estimate up now that upwards of 20,000 Gulf War veterans have now died from biological warfare agents that have been sold by our own government to Iraq, which was used upon our own troops. We knew that Iraq possessed these biological weapons because we produced the biological weapons. We knew that before we sent air troops into the Gulf War. We made up a mixture, a slop of vaccine that I would not literally have one of my dogs inoculated with, and we inoculated air troops with it. The vaccine against mycoplasma fermentis was very poor. It was a rot gut mixture vaccine. What happened was large numbers of our vets actually became sick and infected by the very vaccine that we told them that we used to protect them. On and on it goes. More and more biological weapons being used, produced, and huge quantities of biological agents. Air Force nurse exposes Gulf War syndrome and other diseases. Again, linked to biological warfare agents. The reason I'm showing you this, why we sold and produced so much of biological warfare agents to the Middle East and Saddam Hussein, is to ask the question, a government that would manufacture death and sell that death to a foreign power that was in turn to be used up against our own people, is that government to be trusted? Is that administration to be trusted? And would that administration tell you just how dangerous biological warfare agents are? The situation is, Saddam Hussein, we were in bed with Saddam Hussein. The Ayatollah kicked their backs out of Iran back in 1976. When he came to power, we in turn backed Saddam Hussein. We built him an awesomely massive military machinery, an incredible military machinery that included biological weapons. The idea was Saddam Hussein would use the biologicals on the Iranians, which would exterminate the Iranians, which in turn would turn back and kill them. So we thought we'd end up with the people in power would end up with the entire oil fields. After getting in very great in-depth details, after I found out about the biological agents, I started making huge numbers of phone calls. Those phone calls started going with people that I dealt with in the past. One gentleman that I called early on in my research, when I started writing my book on biological warfare, How to Defend Against Biological Warfare, I contacted Robert Myers, who's with the Michigan Biological Institute, and asked him about biological warfare. And why was it that the United States are letting our people be totally undefended against biological warfare agents? And how are these agents going to be employed against the United States? If we know, if Miriam is correct, and we know that the Middle Eastern people are smuggling weapons back into the United States, biological agents, why are we not telling the American people the truth? The quite simple fact is, if the American people knew the truth, that over 20,000 Americans are now dead, killed by biological agents that we personally sold our enemies, that we knew would be used against our own troops, and we let our troops go into harm's way anyhow. There would probably be a revolt tomorrow morning. Literally, the people would rise up and revolt. And after all the effort that I tried contacting everyone out here about how does one go about defending against biological warfare, everyone said, well, if you're so concerned against biological warfare, why don't you go ahead and write your own book? And so what I did, I went back to my home, those notebooks that I had stashed away deep inside my closet. I went and dug the books out and started putting together my own book on how does one go about defending against biological warfare. I took the data and condensed the data down into a book form and wrote out a step-by-step detail. And the thing about it is, when I started contacting everyone out there about how to defend against biological warfare, just about everyone that I talked with kept telling me, well, you can't defend against it. I couldn't accept that. I'd already seen how to defend against it in my laboratory. And so what I started doing is sitting down and putting together all my notes. All the notes, the step-by-step procedure of how to defend against biological warfare. Bacteria, like we just seen a few minutes ago of anthrax. Just how deadly is anthrax, and how easy it is to be smuggled into the United States. We've seen that a millionth of a gram is almost fatal. Now let's start looking at just how deadly a biological attack against the United States can be. If you would please roll the second film.
In an attack on a large city with an average density of population, a 300-kilogram chemical weapon could kill 3,000 people. A nuclear weapon weighing perhaps 200 kilograms might kill up to 40,000 people. But only 30 kilograms of anthrax, if sprayed over the city on a still day, could kill twice as many.
Quite frightening, folks. Quite frightening and quite real. And come to find out, the fact is out here, I started contacting all the agents that I knew throughout the country. And the problem we have to come up with, how does one go about defending against biological warfare? One thing, people need to acquire antibiotics. They need to acquire huge quantities of antibiotics. Antibiotics, and without a prescription. The only antibiotics I went on the market, started checking, are agricultural antibiotics. Agricultural antibiotics that you can buy in the Farmer's Exchange, panamycin, terramycin, penicillin. As it turned out, one of the main reasons that these antibiotics are used and sold in such quantities in feed and grain stores is that they are very broad spectrum antibiotics, and they can be used very easily. They are very little side effects against it. If you take too much, quite frankly, you cannot overdose on it. And so I had my source of antibiotics. After I had my source of antibiotics, how does one go about taking the antibiotics? And so what I did when I wrote my book, I came up with dosage charts, weight charts. Basically, coming up with a dosage chart. The charts would show, you look at how much you weigh, how heavy you are. Then you go down the list, look across, seeing precisely how much of the antibiotics that you would take, and bingo, there is a solution how to defend against biological warfare. After doing more and more research into this, the very surprising thing, what got me, is that every time I start to go forward, it seems like I go forward a notch, I get knocked back a few notches. I sent my book, after I had wrote the original manuscript, to the people I knew in the Pentagon, people that I knew in various other government organizations, and I started asking them if they would review my book. And when contacts out of the Pentagon, they started calling me. Actually, they contacted me after my book was first on the market. The gentleman tried to give me something like a shuck and drive routine, tell me he's like something like a medical doctor or something of this nature. And he'd ask me, he said, "Mr. Harris, could we ask you a few questions?" I said, "Sure." He'd ask me a question, then I'd hear some muffled talk in the background, then ask me another question. I said, "Let me guess the building that you're in. It's got 5 sides on it, right?" "Yes." He said, "Where's the Pentagon?" I said, "Mr. Harris, is it okay if we put you on a speakerphone?" I said, "Sure, go ahead." When they put me on a speakerphone, the gentleman who talked with me was with part of the casualty management team. And they asked me, they said, "Would you please mind coming in and we'd like to do a military debriefing of you." And I said, "I have no problem with this." And so I went I went and visited a place which is just west of Columbus, Ohio. And there was for a military debriefing. We had a whole team of scientists or engineers in there, several Air Force, Army, other high-ranking officers. During the debriefing, they would give you a lie detector test, if you would, which is they will ask you a question, several questions they know you're going to answer truthfully. They'll get a voice stress analysis, a voice print. And when you get the voice print, they will then ask you a series of other questions, and they will analyze the prints that they get on your future questions, answers to future questions on your initial ones. And that is known as a voice stress analysis. And so they started asking me a series of questions. The interview lasted almost 6 hours. After about 5 hours, the girl who was monitoring the voice stress analysis, she had to get up to go to the bathroom to puke. She came back white as a ghost, and she said that the needle has not varied, not one bit, for 5 hours. He is telling the truth. We started pouring in the numbers. What would happen if the Iraqi cells, we knew that there was 100 cells in 1993. If the 100 cells would release their biologicals, what would be the actual outcome of the United States? And so what we started doing, we started doing the calculating. They knew I was telling the truth. We started running military models. A military model is that where you figure out, you start putting in the data of a military attack, biological attack. Now let's do a recap real quick of just how the Iraqi females, or how the Iraqis are going to carry out a biological attack, okay? Let's just show you just how simple it is. In the film strip we've seen a few moments ago, we've seen how an atomic bomb would take out maybe 8,000 people, how a chemical weapon weighing hundreds, much greater chemical weapon, 3,000 or 4,000 people, but how a biological weapon could take out many times that. First off, a young lady, the Iraqi, will take a vial like this. These are this is actual serum vial. Around the neck of the vial, they put a little string. They will insert this up in the body cavity in their own country. When they're coming into the United States, they're taking an antibiotic, tetracycline, stuff of this nature. That's in case if the vial would leak or anything of this nature, they have no danger whatsoever at catching the disease. When the girl comes into the United States, basically when they get to wherever they're going, they remove the vial and hide it. What proof, you might ask, do we have this is happening? Young lady with the Pentagon, Mrs. Winters, told me in October of this year, or October of 96, they followed 2 Iraqi females from Baghdad coming into Vancouver, Washington. They were taken off an aircraft in Vancouver, Washington, where they took them in and did a body cavity search. One girl, they recovered a vial of anthrax. The other girl was carrying a vial of bubonic plague. Interesting. Okay, so how's the attack going to be taking place? First off, the young lady takes the vial. She puts in 2 milliliters of skim milk, 2 milliliters of distilled water, and it's set aside, begins to ferment. Takes a 125 milliliter flask, puts in 100 milliliters of water. Then she introduces some nutrient broth powder. Where do they get the powder at? That's interesting. Mail order catalog, same one Saddam Hussein got his material from. That was Acumedia Corporation. And this one here, of course, is coming out of Baltimore, Maryland. Mail order, no questions asked. Same thing where Saddam Hussein got his. Put this in the flask, put a piece of tinfoil over it, set it on the eye, and bring it to a boil. Once it boils, let it cool till you can touch the inside of your wrist comfortably. Dump the contents of this vial under this one. The plague starts growing up in this one. Plague numbers start growing up in this and further. After 9 days of agitation, each cell member, 10 of them, has already gone out and purchased 3 stainless steel pump-up sprayers. These sprayers are placed upon a stove eye, brought to a boil, put the water in it, hook it, let it chill down, get your air tubing hook up to it, air pump to provide air to it. Take the nutrient broth powder, open up the tank, dump in your water, dump in your nutrient broth powder. That's so. This is permitted to cool. Then, after the plague has gone for 9 days, the young lady will take your first 100 milliliter solution, take a pipette, remove 10 milliliters, put 10 milliliters in each one of these vials. These vials, they put a string around the neck, go into the restroom, slide it up in the body cavity just like a Tampax. And they said, quite frankly, what are they going to do? Stop every girl going down the street, check them, see if they're carrying a vial? Not really. It's not going to happen. She then takes it to the cell member, opens the contents of the vial, dumps it into the tank, 3.5 milliliter into each tank. These tanks are permitted to ferment, grow for about 9 days. After they're permitted to ferment, the Venturis, these are the Venturis. How hard is it to get? Well, all you got to do is order it from Aircraft Supply House right here in the United States. Matter of fact, they'll take Discover Card, Visa, and American Express. Nope, no problem. And then mail order, just mail order. This here acts like a crude carburetor. What they do, they take this, they bolt it underneath of a car. The tubing from the tank is placed in a car. It's ran down to it, like so. Bolted underneath the car. Once the car gets up to 55 miles an hour, like driving down a highway, 2 o'clock in the morning, reach over and you open the valve. This produces a tremendous vacuum in here, the wind blowing through it, produces a tremendous vortex, air spinning out of it. And then when it's driving down the road, basically what you got is a thin mist coming out behind the car. Chances are, if you were right behind the car and knew what they were doing, you see the car going, you see a little mist coming up behind it, you say, well, it's exhaust fumes. Or you can put a fake exhaust pipe out the back of this, coming out the back of the car. Again, there's no smell, there's no taste, there's no boom, there's no kabang. Nothing whatsoever. There's no, and let's just start with plague first, because they said that's what they're going to use, bubonic plague. There's no symptoms to the beginning of the 3rd day. Beginning of the 3rd day, you wake up, and your person will start coughing up blood. Every time they hack and spew, they spew more bubonic plague out into the air. Anybody who breathes in that bubonic plague within 3 days, they'll also be down with bubonic plague. We started running the numbers. We took the numbers and fed it into the computers. After we fed it into the computer, the numbers, we started asking the question, how many people are we going to lose? What we found out was that what the computer model showed us, if we have only 100 cells in the continental United States, and these 100 cells will give us 1,000 points of release. After 1,000 points of release, we fed it into the computer. What the computer model showed us was that if we know the day of the attack, if we know the hour of the attack, if we know the minute of the attack, as we stand right here, right now, today, we're going to lose 180 million people. If we do not know the day of the attack, but only start knowing when people start dropping dead, we can literally lose upwards of 230 million people. Now they said, okay, what would be the long-term effects? Okay, let's just go with bubonic plague. Bubonic plague, once it's sprayed out into the air, within 48 hours after it's sprayed out, it'll start drying out and dying. If it hasn't been breathed in within the first 48 hours, it's not going to hurt you, it's going to die. It starts settling out. But anybody who catches the plague, every person who catches that plague, when they're coughing, coming out like a subway, an elevator, every cough they have, they spew out more bubonic plague into the air. If they hit a city with bubonic plague, the people spread out from that city. Wherever they go into, every area that they go into, they spread more bubonic plague. Now people will say, well, but you have antibiotics that will treat it. Yes, we do. We have a major problem, however. That major problem is the availability of antibiotics. This comes straight from Ann Johnson of the Pentagon, and also we worked with the Michigan Biological Institute. If they hit a single city, let's just say New York City right now, with, let's just say, bubonic plague, just bubonic plague. If, with the way our current medical practices are set up in the United States, and this is what the Pentagon officials told me, and officials at the Pentagon, these were with the casualty management teams. Casualty management teams, they use a process that's known as triage. Triage meaning 3. When your patients are coming into the hospital, You will divide them into 3 different categories. Category 1, they need minor first aid. Category 2, moderate to heavy treatment. Category 3, extremely heavy treatment. And most of them are going to lose. We see with bubonic plague or anthrax, let's say bubonic plague, once you start showing the symptoms, once the symptoms manifest themselves, you're dead. Right off the bat. If you came into the hospital and you're coughing up bubonic plague, if I give you enough antibiotic to take care of all the plague bacteria in your lungs, they still burst open, release enough bubonic plague into your bloodstream. It's going to, 1, destroy the lung tissue. 2, the toxins are going to knock out your liver, your spleen, your kidney, your brain. Which means once you start showing the symptoms of pneumonic plague, you are dead. Plain and simple. Now, let's go back with anthrax. Anthrax has got as far as being contagious from one person to the other, it's not as bad, not quite as bad. Which means that anthrax is sprayed out into the air and sprayed down. Once it's sprayed out in the air, if you catch it, and then you go into and took a real good shower, you didn't know you'd catch it, you changed clothes, you took your shower, got on an aircraft, went somewhere else. Once you start, you're going to wake up the symptoms on the beginning of the 2nd day. You get initial flu-like symptoms, then you get a burning high fever. Then the bacteria breaks out of your lungs into your bloodstream, and it starts releasing a complement-fixing compound. What this does is cause your blood to coagulate. You get what's known as disseminated intravascular coagulation. One form of blood clot causes a stroke. Now, could you imagine you're driving to the hospital, you got a burning high fever, and then within a few minute period of time, all the blood inside your body coagulates. You're dead. If you make it to the hospital, once you have started showing the symptoms of anthrax, you're dead. There is, regardless of what we give you, there's nothing more that we can do for you. Flat out cannot do for you. One thing, my contacts with the Pentagon who dealt with triage said that if the Iraqis would hit a single American city like New York City, with our current medical procedures that we're using right now, it would strip this nation of its entire antibiotic supply. The procedures we have right now is that you take the worst patients first. But you've got to remember is that once you start showing the symptoms, you're dead. So which means only the people coming to the hospital, only those people who are bringing the people who are sick would be the ones who should be given the antibiotics. The ones who've already got the symptoms, they're dead. Quite frankly, they're dead. Now, with anthrax, once it's released, unlike plague, once it's released into the air, within 48 hours, it's going to start dying. Plagues will start dying. Anthrax, on the other hand, has got a little bit longer shelf life. We had an island off the Scottish coast where we experimented with an anthrax bomb back in the 40s. It's about 6 acres square. I've been told it's about flat as a pancake. We've tried every known procedure known to mankind to decontaminate that island. And that island is still off limits, and it's flat as a pancake, 6 acres square. You see, the shelf life of anthrax spores is approximately 5,000 years. Now, if you hit a city, let's say like New York City or what have you, the question becomes, how do you decontaminate it? If we could not decontaminate an island that was 6 acres square, how do you decontaminate a city? The situation is you do not decontaminate the city. Quite frankly, what happens? The city becomes uninhabitable. Also, the Pentagon told me flat out that they have already run contingency plans on Washington, D.C. They said right now we have in Washington, D.C. one hospital that is set up to take care of biological casualties. That hospital had 2 doctors and 2 beds. Out of the doctors' own mouths, they said, we would have tens of thousands of people die waiting for treatment. Quite frankly, we have no warning equipment, stuff of this nature. Now, with the Pentagon told me that the casualty management teams, if we lost 4,000 people in a single day in Washington, D.C., it would literally overwhelm everything we had. It would panic us out of existence. Now, a single container of anthrax. Let's just go to New York City. Let's just take New York City as an example. We're going to run a little tape on about just what happened in New York City if someone used a single container of anthrax and a commercial paint sprayer, which is very inefficient.
White House security experts have examined just such a scenario. A small ship sailing off Manhattan, up the Hudson River, could disperse anthrax spores using an industrial paint sprayer. Within 48 hours, over 400,000 people would die. Long before then, the boat would have been destroyed. The terrorists would have escaped.
400,000 people. 400,000. One thing that the military was so concerned about New York City is that is their stock exchange. We have all the stockbrokers in New York City. If they would hit a single city, New York City, with a single container of anthrax, just one, we are going to lose upwards of 400,000 people. But see, that's what the commercial paint sprayer. This thing is far more efficient than a paint sprayer. Far more efficient. It is like with a commercial paint sprayer, 400,000 people. With this little unit here, you might even go as much as 1 million people. Just think about it, 1 million people. Now, the question is, this is from the Pentagon, what do you do with the bodies? Our mortuaries are set up right now that if, for so many deaths per 1,000 people coming in, as a single burp in population, we do not have, the problem is disposing of the corpses. You see, with anthrax, if a person dies in place and you leave the bodies laying around, they will decompose. After they decompose, the wind starts blowing through them, the remains, and the anthrax spores start coming up in the air again. And so you could have people coming in years later dying of anthrax. Not only that, with New York City, if you get a little bit of an economic burp, the stock market does a dip. What would happen if in one day, in and around the New York Stock Exchange, you lost 400,000 people, including all your stockbrokers, most of your stockbrokers, secretarial staff, stuff of this nature? The finances of the United States and the world, quite frankly, head south instantly right then. Not only that, it's the problem, how do you restart the stock market? The restart the stock market is that you cannot just bring in stockbrokers. If you bring in stockbrokers, they don't know where the trading was. So you have to bring in secretarial staff way upstream. Now, how do you bring in secretarial staff and stockbrokers if anthrax can live into the city up to upwards of 5,000 years? So we're running into some major, very, very major problems. Now, some questions may be asked. How do we know this is possible? How do we know something like this could take place and happen in the future? It's very interesting. Very, very interesting. February 13th, 1997. I received a telephone call from a gentleman who inquired whether I would be home that afternoon. And I told him that I would. Around 13th of February, around 4 p.m., I received another telephone call. From the roar in the phone, I could tell where the person was calling from either a very large truck or an aircraft. The gentleman informed me that he was in a private aircraft and asked if I would meet him at the local airport. He asked me to meet him out on the tarmac, away from the little flight service building and away from the aircraft hangars. I arrived at the airstrip and had just walked out on the tarmac just before the aircraft arrived. They were flying a Mooney Mark 21. They landed and taxied over to where I was standing. Two gentlemen in their late 40s or 50s wearing Iowa State University starter jackets got out of the airplane, and after making sure I was who I said I was, started informing me of the occurrences that had just taken place at the Iowa State University School of Veterinary Medicine in and around the little town of Ames, Iowa. The following is their stories that related it to me. Beginning in around on February the 3rd, several Middle Eastern students were coming up missing, and the story was they had been carted off in the middle of the night by individuals dressed in black. February 6th and the 7th, 1997, they said there was a strange absence of Middle Eastern students in and around the Iowa University. There were numerous reports of female Iraqi students being apprehended as they were walking down a sidewalk. And what would happen was that a black van would pull up and several people dressed in black would jump out and grab the girl and force her into the van. If anyone objected, they would flash some kind of identification and hollering out national security, national security. The stories that was filtering back was that these girls were being taken to a secluded location, strapped down to an exam table with a belt across their waist and across their shoulders with their arms stretched out to either side strapped down. They were then stripped from the waist down. Their legs were strapped into brackets on either side and spread apart. They were forcibly given vaginal exams. Several different kinds of instruments were used on them. They could scream as loud as they want to. It did them to no good. After examination, their clothes were put back on them, and they were returned close to where they were picked up without any explanation, and then they were let go. They also informed me later on that tracking devices, electronic tracking devices, had been attached to their clothing. Figuring that the girls would be traumatized, they would turn them loose, and they would probably try to run to a place that they thought they had security, they had safety. Unbeknownst to them, they did an old ploy, which is known as flushing the pigeons, like a homing pigeon. You let it go, and it flies back to where it came from. Okay, on February the 8th and the 9th, 1997, numerous homes and apartments occupied by Middle Eastern students were raided with people dressed in black. During these raids, people dressed in black were seen coming from the dwellings carrying large numbers of silver containers and a couple of instances carrying a funnel or horn-shaped device. It was during one of these raids that someone observed a young lady opening the back window of one of the apartments, splitting open the screen and jumping out. Someone inside of the apartment handed her one of the silver containers and a horn-looking device. She quickly took the device over near a trash dumpster and tried to hide the device behind the dumpster, obviously hoping to return later to retrieve the device. Then quickly returned to her apartment through the back window. The person who observed the lady trying to hide the devices quickly ran the trash dumpster and retrieved the devices, took them to his car and locked them in a trunk, and drove them to another location. The devices was later returned to one of the two gentlemen who had flown them down to me. On February 10th, 12th, 1997, the two gentlemen said that they had expected there to be all kinds of press coverage concerning the raids, but to their great surprise, there was nothing. Absolutely nothing appeared on TV, the local papers concerning the raids. They said that they then knew that there was some kind of unholy alliance going on that would suppress a story like this. One of the gentlemen said that he had seen me on several times on radio talk shows concerning germ warfare and the fact that Middle Eastern students had already been caught bringing vials of bubonic plague and anthrax into Vancouver, Washington. They said that they had contacted some people in the microbiology department who identified the containers as microbiological culture containers, and very expensive ones at that. It was at that point they decided to get the devices to me in order that I could make them available to the Christian community, and who could start taking protective precautions, that the Christian community could start realizing that this threat is real. It's very real. Also hoping that enough people knew that I had taken pictures of these devices and distributed them around that they wanted to get the devices to me, okay? And two of the devices that were actually retrieved, this is the actual equipment that was retrieved from that apartment. This is known as a chemostat. This is the actual device that was taken. And notice the tubing had been ripped apart. The lines have been ripped apart in great haste. Whoever had this device in there was trying to get it out of the apartment at an extremely fast rate. When I opened the container on the first time to make certain it didn't have a live culture in it, I found nutrient broth powder was actually growing. A nutrient broth powder or liquid had already been introduced into the container. This device was up and fully operational. They were ready. Only thing they were ready for was the vial to be delivered. Remember, they picked up 14 girls. Out of 14 girls, 2 of them, they retrieved 2 of the smaller vials that had not been lyophilized or had not been activated yet. But out of 5 of the women, they recovered the 10 milliliter test tube, each one containing approximately 10 milliliters of military-grade anthrax. Only thing this had to have been done was taken to the apartment, dumped into the container, which had already had the nutrient broth powder in it and the water, sterilized and ready to go. Only thing would have had to have been done then, activated, hooked up the air pump, let set for 2 or 3 days. This is the actual Venturi, the actual one that was retrieved from behind the trash dumpster. It was not inside the trash dumpster, but hidden down beside it and covered with paper debris like they were planning on retrieving it later. So this was actually the actual equipment that was being in the process of set up for a massive biological attack upon one of the cities. And I contacted my contacts within the Central Intelligence Agency. What they told me was taking place up there was a Pegasus operation. Pegasus, which meant they used a joint venture of ex-Central Intelligence Agencies. Some of them were still CIA, ex-Navy SEALs, Special Forces, Green Beret. And had gone in on this group. And in February, we have the second holiest Muslim holiday. That holiday is Ramadan. And apparently what had happened is that they had the Iraqis had a loose cannon situation on their hands, meaning that those guys up there was not going to wait till July or something of this nature to launch their attack. They were moving ahead in an early deal. And what the story was, some of their own people are the ones who turned them into us. Folks, we've been lucky so far. We have been very, very, very lucky. Now, let's take a look at that reel again, the last reel on New York City. What would actually take place? What would happen? What would have happened? Remember, they picked up over 30 of these containers up and around that little town of Iowa. They picked up 10, actually 9, because this is one of them, of the Venturis, 9 of the Venturis. Now let's take a look and see what they could have done with just one of those containers now. Let's recap it.
White House security experts have examined just such a scenario. A small ship sailing off Manhattan, up the Hudson River, could disperse anthrax spores using an industrial paint sprayer. Within 48 hours, over 400,000 people would die. Long before then, the boat would have been destroyed. The terrorists would have escaped.
400,000 people. Folks, how many times have you turned on your local news lately? Have you picked up your local newspapers and saying that we are in imminent danger of a major biological attack coming again in the United States? And I mean imminent danger. It's strange. I've checked the local newspapers and everything else, and there is very little. There is almost nothing taking place. What is going on out here? People are going to ask, what is actually going on out here? And what is actually happening is that on the 28th of February, they had an emergency meeting, which is FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Association. They had Department of Defense, DOD, National Security personnel, and this was aired on C-SPAN. During that presentation, numerous individuals within our government agencies were discussing about how prepared are we for a major biological attack against the United States. What these people were talking about, what they were actually relating to us, is that we are in absolute dire circumstances. Give you a recount of this here, the 28th, on the 28th C-SPAN. The House National Security Subcommittee, chaired by Republican Charles Weldon, Republican Pennsylvania, held a hearing on the federal response to domestic terrorism. The hearing was aired on C-SPAN the evening of February 28th. But now, get this, the funny thing, on March the 1st, right after it was aired on C-SPAN, numerous people started calling in and finding out how serious it is. And then C-SPAN denied that the tape had ever aired, even though numerous people around the country had their VCRs turned on, had the tape in the VCRs, and actually had footage of those actual hearings being taken place. The particular significance of this hearing is that it became obvious that the subcommittee members and the witnesses were acknowledgeable about a biological incident in Iowa, taking place in Iowa. The federal response to terrorism focused on the federal government's, what the federal government could assist and how the federal government could assist local authorities in proper response to chemical and biological threats. Some of the committee members that attended were Republican Thomas Allen, Democrat of Maine, Roscoe Bartlett, Republican Maryland, Jim Gibbons, Republicans Nevada, Patrick Kennedy, Democrat Rhode Island, Jane Harmon, Democrat California, Jim Turner, Democrat of Texas, and others who were visible in the videotape. A few of those witnesses before the subcommittee were Fire Chief Gary Myers, Oklahoma City, Alan Holmes, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations, and Philip Wilcox, the State Department's Counterterrorism Coordinator. Quite a bit of focus was on getting first responders, emergency medical systems, and fire departments better trained for chemical and biological emergencies. While wrestling with those decisions as to who should receive correct responsive training, it was disclosed that the federal departments had apparently car-marked 26 cities, had already earmarked these cities, 26 cities based on population to receive federal training and equipment for responding to the terrorist threat, specifically the threat in the form of nuclear, biological, and chemical. Pointing out there was also a potential threat against smaller localities. It was Mr. Bartlett who remarked that ordinarily one does not think of a small town in Iowa as needing to prepare itself for potential biological protection. A biodetector kit and newly developed chemical biological protective suit, an astronaut suit, were displayed for the committee members to examine. It would truly seem that the king is naked, but C-SPAN does not wish to be the young boy who first publicly remarks about it. The public at large is naked to the threat, regardless. We are absolute butt naked in the wind. And this is where we're at, folks. This is absolutely where we are at this point in time. The country is threatening to a biological Pearl Harbor. How easy it would be to start a crash program of how to defend this country against biological weapons. Basically, I produced a book in a few days, weeks. My book, Bacteriological Warfare, A Major Threat to North America. Inside the book is everything they needed, all the necessary information to defend against biological agents. While the committee was going on, to recap a little bit earlier, the Pentagon, when I was discussing some comments with the Pentagon, they told me that they had gone down and checked their latest books that they had on how to deal with biological warfare. They said the date on their books was 1957. He said, Mr. Harris, your book is the latest book there is on the subject. This is, folks, this is almost, it's unheard of. And when the committees, when they were having those hearings in Washington, the one I just discussed, one of the gentlemen said, we now have books available on how that we can help defend against biological warfare. They were using my book. The flattery in one sense, yes, but the Center for Disease Control is being paid $250,000 per minute. Per minute, $250,000. And they are doing everything in their power to keep the American people from realizing the threat of biological warfare. At this point in time, I hope that you realize that the threat is very, very real. The threat is real. What to do? First off, you need to get organized. People need to get organized into groups. You need to prepare your home for a biological attack. Learn which antibiotics there is to take, where to acquire these antibiotics, how much of the antibiotics there is that you need to take. Not only do you need to learn how the antibiotics, I strongly recommend the ladies in the community get involved in the home nursing courses, first aid courses, because even now the government is admitting that if we hit a single city, and recent Senate hearings on this, they were having all-out hearings, and the retired Senator Sam Nunn, who chaired those hearings, said that it is not a question of whether or not the United States is going to be hit with a biological attack. It is not if, it is when. A couple little other incidents that was furnished to me by the intelligence community. Last fall in October, in Dallas, Texas, they caught 5 Iraqis getting off of an aircraft. The Iraqi, 3 men and 2 women. They were carrying specially designed suitcases. Inside the suitcases were specially designed thermos bottles. Inside the thermos bottles were freeze-dried fleas, or super chilled fleas, contaminated with bubonic plague. The day after that, Brownsville, Texas, INS officials caught a lady coming across the border with a suitcase. Inside the suitcase were specially designed thermos bottles. Inside the thermos bottles were super chilled fleas contaminated with bubonic plague. It's interesting to note that the summer prior to this, that a CIA and an operations over in to help the Kurds to try to get Saddam Hussein overthrown, we provided the Kurds with specially designed thermos bottles containing super chilled fleas contaminated with bubonic plague to spread in and around Baghdad in order to cause a plague to break out and destabilize Saddam Hussein's government. These thermos bottles that were found down in Texas were identical, absolutely identical, to the thermos bottles that we shipped to to the Kurds, except they were made from Iraqi materials. Folks, this is playing games out here. Okay, these people are absolutely playing games on us. Okay, the game is very serious. The game becomes who has the largest number of people after these biological operations is over wins the game. We are absolutely vulnerable. We are totally vulnerable to the ravages of biological warfare. Our government is doing absolutely nothing except protecting their own people. Here on the last part of March, the government came out and admitted that they, in several newspapers across the country, they were in the process of inoculating 1.5 million troops, plus other high-ranking military people in the government, again anthrax. And in December, there was an investigation that took place by a private news agency in which they went into Washington and they started interviewing people in the Washington area. Come to find out there was one hospital that was set up to take care of biological casualties. That one hospital had 2 doctors, 2 beds. And they said themselves, tens of thousands of people will die They then, before they get treatment, they then went and asked the military. The military has been diverting large supplies of antibiotics from civilian use into strategic reserves. When the military was asked, who are these antibiotics for? The question was, the answer was given for, he'll be used for civilian use. Which civilians was the next question? Oh, those of high priority. Those of high priority. I doubt very seriously if that's going to take care of the Christian community. I really doubt it. Everything that we talked about here in the lecture, we've been talking about biological weapons, biological warfare, and how easy it is to do, how easy it is to manufacture. You do not need sophisticated equipment to recover the anthrax, simple microscope, a few chemicals. Knowing where to go get it, I recovered it in 10 days just to see if I could do it. In Australia now, we're having places where we have an anthrax, a little bit of anthrax breaking out in cattle. Somebody knowing what they were doing, going there, they could have a culture in a couple of days. The equipment. The Venturi's could be located from any aircraft supply houses. The tanks, that particular one was traced, that tank there was actually manufactured by the Millipore Corporation over in Maryland. It's a very expensive unit. And actually, you can go with a cheaper unit, be just as efficient. If you went with a less expensive unit in the Venturi there, with the nutrient broth, and you could easily make the nutrient broth if you didn't know if you couldn't obtain it, and sprayed it out, you could easily, with anthrax, take out 400,000, 500,000, 600,000 at a time. There's no trouble at all. But I'm reminded back to the Holy Bible now, and started looking back to what our Lord said, and what the angel said to Brother John on the Isle of Patmos all those many hundreds of years ago, almost 1900, over 1900 years ago now. And it said, then the vials were opened, and the plagues were poured out upon mankind. And in the 18th chapter of Revelations, it starts talking about the cities, how the cities become the habitat of every foul creature. It's strange and hateful bird that vultures are not affected by anthrax, and certain types of dogs are seemingly immune to anthrax. These cities, could the burning be that the only way you'd be able to have it do anything with it, they're burning the corpses? And the merchants of the earth stand far off and wail because of all their wealth, all their money. Everything that they had is now gone. A single biological attack on New York City, and their stock market is gone. The paper money, the fiat money that we have becomes essentially worthless. The economy that we have in this country is gone, disintegrated. It is time now that the Christian community do two things. One, if you do not have a personal relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ, it's time you got one. It's time you get one in a very, very quick manner. If you do not have supplies of antibiotics, do not know how to deal with biological weapons, we have the books available, Bacteriological Warfare, A Major Threat to North America. These are available. Antibiotics are now available. You can still get them at the Farmers Exchange, feed and grain stores. You can get it. But understand, everything that God has ever written, from the prophets of old, coming forward through the Old Testament, to the appearance of our Lord Jesus Christ, and everything that has appeared coming down through the ages has come to pass. And I now see, now the Iraqi cells, we know the Middle Eastern cells are here in this country. And if, let's just say that our security forces was able to go out and round up every single solitary cell member, they found them all. They got them all, every single one. It still doesn't change things, because now the knowledge is out there. The biological genie has now been let out of the bottle by our own Central Intelligence Agency. The equipment is available from mail order supply. They know where to get it. The equipment is very easy to obtain. And so if they stopped every cell, which they're not going to, if they stopped them all, it still does not prevent a biological disaster to be being released almost at any time. So folks, we're at the point in time in history that it's time, the one, to get on a right course with the Lord, and two, to get your household in order. And I will go to the close with referring to Ezekiel. I think it's 33. And it says that a people, a watchman, to put the watchman on the tower. And if the watchman see the sword come, and he blows the trumpet, if the person hears the trumpet blows and does not heed the warning, and the sword comes and takes him away, he has been taken away for iniquity's sake. If, however, the person hears the trumpet being blown and flees, then his life is spared. He preserves his life. If the watchman sees a sword coming and doesn't blow the horn, and the sword comes and takes the people away, they've been taken away for iniquity's sake. But I will require the blood of that person at the watchman's hand. Microbiologists in this country, the diagnostic microbiologists, are the biological watchmen on the wall. And we're now blowing the trumpet as loud and hard as we can possibly blow the trumpet. I've heard people say that, oh, God would not bring this great scourge down upon this nation. This nation was a Christian nation at one time. Even Supreme Court hearings at the turn of the century says this is a Christian nation at that time. And people try to say that God would not bring the scourge down upon the land. What did he do to Sodom and Gomorrah? And if God does not judge this country, he is going to have to raise Sodom and Gomorrah back up and apologize. You know something? Reading through the whole Bible, I've never found one passage where God has ever apologized to anyone. So now, folks, your blood is upon your own hands. Mine are clean. You have been warned. I can do no more. Good day.